Father Pio bore the stigmata as a testimony to the suffering of Jesus. As we can see, Padre Pio had holes in his hands, just like Jesus did when he was crucified on the cross. Throughout his life, he embraced faith, living a life dedicated to God. At an important moment, he revealed a prophecy about the 50-year milestone. Could this be a countdown to the final day? Do we only have 50 more years? Or does this number 50 point to another prediction? Join us when we discover the secrets we're hiding for a while. The 50-year prophecy. Let's meet Modesto Vinelli, a photographer from San Giovanni Rotondo, took some photographs of Padre Pio a few months after he had received the stigmata in 1918. In the photographs, this photographer is the one behind the famous pictures of Father Pio and the clearly visible stigmata wounds. Modesto was selling copies of these photographs to the faithful. Then one day, a man on seeing the pictures began to swear and blaspheme. He took one of the pictures, tore it up, and trampled on it. Modesto flew into a rage. He kicked and slapped the man. A fight started. The man was injured, and Modesto was thrown into jail for 40 days. When he came out of jail, Modesto went to Padre Pio and told him the whole story. Perhaps because he sensed Modesto's faith, Padre Pio drew him closer and whispered a shocking secret to him. Padre Pio said, "Modesto, we have 50 years ahead of us." Modesto did not understand, but he continued to meet Padre Pio every year on the 20th of September, the anniversary of the apparition of the stigmata. Each time Padre Pio would speak to him with the same symbolic words concerning a certain period of time. Then, on the 25th anniversary of the stigmata, Padre Pio told him, "Modesto, remember that we still have 25 years." At this moment, Modesto suddenly realized that Padre Pio was referring to the number of years he had left to live. In a state of anxious anticipation, Modesto waited for time to pass, continuously praying for God's protection, regardless of the decreasing number of years, which hinted at something significant. Finally, on September 20th, 1968, when Modesto met Padre Pio on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the stigmata, Padre Pio, in a sad but very loving way, said, "Modesto, the 50 years are over." And 3 days later, Padre Pio died. It wasn't until that time that the world came to know what Padre Pio meant by the 50 years he had spoken of. So the 50 years was a reference to how many years Padre Pio would carry the stigmata before his death. Born holy, die holy. I need to love you more and more, but I don't have any more love in my heart. I have given all my love to you. If you want more, fill my heart with your love, and then oblige me to love you more and more, and I will not refuse you. Padre Pio was praying before a wooden crucifix on September 20th, 1918, when he was overwhelmed by numbness and drowsiness, and then he fell asleep on the floor. When he woke up, he soaked in his own blood, then dragged himself to his cell and in horror discovered his wounds. From that very moment, Padre Pio's stigmata became the core of controversy that divided the religious and other people, friends or foes. Pio seems to have been destined to carry the mission of carrying the cross on his shoulders since he was born. "Peppa, the child was born wrapped in a white veil, and that's a good sign. He will be holy," said the midwife to Pio's mother when she lifted the newborn baby in the afternoon of May 25th, 1887. Padre Pio's real name was Francesco Forgione. As a little boy, Francesco Forgione was called Franci. Franci liked to hear stories about Christ, Mary, and the saints. He used to like to remain alone, listening to distant voices, mysterious heavenly utterances, and echoes of invisible bells that sounded only for him. You know, there was a time when the Vatican silent our Father Pio. So how did he face to that? And what was his reaction? Padre Pio is to be stripped of all the faculties of his priestly ministry except the faculty to celebrate the Holy Mass, which he may continue to do, provided that it is done in private, within the walls of the friary, in the inner chapel, and not publicly in church. It was a difficult cross for him to bear. Instead of being angry, he obeyed and submitted to the decree. Our saintly friar responded, "God's will be done. The will of the superiors is the will of God." Padre Pio would spend the next several years in silence, celebrating Mass privately and accepting no visitors. He couldn't even write to his spiritual children. In spite of the immense goodness of his heart, in spite of his pure holiness, and in spite of his invaluable service to thousands of his spiritual children, Padre Pio experienced many difficult trials. His very goodness and holiness was a great threat to some priests. They resented his fame, and they falsely accused him of being a hoax. Some of these priests were very influential people, and because of their accusations, the Vatican office responsible for overseeing questions of faith and morals took some negative decisions against Padre Pio. He was condemned, and restrictions were placed on his freedom to carry out his ministry. Padre Pio had endured incredibly enormous suffering throughout his life, consisting of more persecution, humiliation, accusations, slanders, trials, and condemnations than one can imagine. Although he implored divine providence to remove from him those signs that caused him so many afflictions and misunderstandings, he never asked to be relieved of the pain they produced. It pleased our Lord that his faithful servant imitated him during a Calvary of 50 years, to his indescribable and unbearable confusion and humiliation. Numerous books have been written about the persecutions suffered by Padre Pio, refuting the accusations brought against him, revealing the bad faith of his detractors, and reporting the facts in full detail. The physical sufferings brought on by the stigmata, the almost superhuman efforts involved in his extraordinarily fruitful pastoral work, and the calumnies and persecutions that crucified his soul redounded to his glory even on this earth. In 1962, dozens of bishops and archbishops participating in the Second Vatican Council visited him. On September 20th, 1968, the 50th anniversary of his stigmatization, Padre Pio realized that his end was near. On September 22nd, after his morning Mass, the people acclaimed him. By 10:30, pallid and tremulous, he barely had the strength to raise his cold hands and bless the numerous crowd from the window of the old church. There was something ineffable in their joy and applause as they waved their hands and handkerchiefs in response to his greeting. In the afternoon, after the last blessing of the faithful who had attended Mass, he withdrew into his quarters. The priest in attendance tells us that at that moment, the window of Padre Pio's cell closed forever, leaving behind the memory of a man who inspired all those who approached him to call him Father. At 2 a.m. of the 23rd, after receiving the anointing of the sick, with a rosary in his hands, the names of Jesus and Mary on his lips, his soul soared to heaven. He was 81 years of age. A veritable mass of people came to pay their last respects to his holy remains. And the chronicles of the monastery record that what took place was not the funeral, but the triumph of Padre Pio. Thus began, in eternity, the life of one of today's most venerated saints in Italy and around the world. It was in 1973 that the cause for Padre Pio's canonization was taken up. But for the next 10 years, nothing happened because Padre Pio's name was still on the list of people condemned by the Holy Office. It was Pope John Paul II who intervened to remove the obstacles that were preventing Padre Pio from being canonized into a saint. The Pope had met Padre Pio in 1947, and since then, he remained an admirer and supporter of Padre Pio. Finally, on May 2, 1999, Pope John Paul II beatified Padre Pio, and he now became Saint Pio, Padre Pio and the presence of God. In December 1902, as Francesco, future Padre Pio, was preparing to join the Capuchin monastery in Morcone, he had a vision. In the vision, he saw a beautiful, majestic man who was as resplendent as the sun standing next to him. This man took Francesco by the hand and led him to a big field where there was a huge gathering of men divided into two groups. On one side, he saw men of most beautiful countenance. They were dressed in snow-white garments. On the other side, he saw men dressed in black garments. They looked like dark shadows. Suddenly, Francesco found himself in the middle of the two groups. Then he saw a very tall, monstrous-looking man coming towards him. Francesco wanted to run away, but the enlightened being standing next to him would not permit that. He said, "Your every resistance is in vain. You must fight him. Take heart. Enter confidently into the battle. Go forth with courage. I will be at your side. I will help you, and I won't let him kill you." Francesco started to fight with the monster. The battle was fierce. Finally, with the help of the enlightened being, Francesco was able to defeat the monster. The monster then, along with all the men dressed in black, fled with shrieks, curses, and deafening cries. The enlightened being then put a beautiful crown on the head of Francesco, but the good man immediately took the crown off, explaining, "I have an even more beautiful one set aside for you. Know that you are able to fight the good fight with the being whom you have just fought. He will come back to attack you. Fight valiantly, and don't doubt my help. Don't be afraid of him. Don't be frightened by his formidable might. I'll be with you. I'll always help you, so that you will always succeed in conquering him." Lucia Iadanza was a spiritual daughter of Padre Pio. As a young woman, she dedicated her life to the service of God and never married. She was very holy. Every month she traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo to attend Padre Pio's prayer sessions. Here she spent most of her time in prayer and service. She would also cook Padre Pio's favorite vegetable, broccoli rabe, and take it to him at the monastery. During the midnight Christmas prayer, Padre Pio would carry a statue of the baby Jesus in the procession. The procession began from the choir loft of the church and passed through the cloister of the monastery and down the corridors and halls. In the church, all the monks held candles and sang hymns. On reaching the altar, Padre Pio would place the baby Jesus in the Christmas crib. On December 24, 1922, during one such midnight Christmas celebration, Lucia Iadanza was also present. She came to the church early to attend the midnight prayer. As it was very cold that night, a stove was kept in the sacristy of the church to keep the place warm. Lucia and 3 of her women companions sat near the stove to warm themselves. Soon Lucia's 3 companions fell asleep, but Lucia was awake and was praying on her rosary beads. When Padre Pio was leading the procession, she saw that he was holding not the statue of infant Jesus, but the real baby Jesus who was very much alive. She also saw that there was a halo of golden light around the baby Jesus, and Padre Pio's face was radiating with a beautiful light. As Padre Pio came close towards her, the baby Jesus disappeared. Padre Pio asked her what she had seen, and she described to him what she just experienced. Then Padre Pio asked her not to tell this to anyone. There was one other person who saw Padre Pio carrying baby Jesus. It was Father Raffaele of Sant'Elia a Pianici. In 1919, Raffaele was studying for his priesthood. In the September of that year, he obtained permission to spend 4 days in San Giovanni Rotondo. At the monastery, Padre Pio welcomed him with great love and promised to assist him in his spiritual life. Raffaele was given a room right next to Padre Pio's. One night, he could not sleep. Finally, at midnight, he decided to get up. When he opened the door of his cell, he saw Padre Pio walking down the hall very slowly, immersed in prayer. His face was suffused with a beautiful light. In his arms was the child Jesus. As was the experience of Lucia Iadanza, Raffaele saw that he was not holding a statue or an image, but a real baby. Raffaele had this experience on September 20th, 1919, the 1-year anniversary of Padre Pio's stigmata. It was in the year 1905, when Brother Pio was studying at Sant'Elia a Pianici, he had a very extraordinary experience. On January 18th, 1905, at around 11 p.m., he and Brother Anastasio were in the choir, when suddenly Brother Pio found himself far away in a wealthy home where the father was dying while a child was being born. Then suddenly, the Virgin Mary appeared and entrusted the child to him and asked him to look after the child's spiritual well-being. She revealed to him that many years from now, when the child would have grown into a young woman, he will meet her for the first time at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Later, the young woman will come to see him at San Giovanni Rotondo. 3 weeks after he had this experience, Brother Pio wrote it down and submitted it to his superiors. This deposition of Brother Pio, dated February 1905, is still preserved in its original in the archives of the monastery at San Giovanni Rotondo. In the meantime, on the night of January 18, 1905, a wealthy man by the name of Giovanni Battista Rizzani was dying in the city of Udine, some 350 miles to the north of Sant'Elia a Pianici. He was a non-believer, but his wife was a very devout Catholic. At the time Giovanni Battista Rizzani was dying, his wife, Leonilda Rizzani, was 8 months pregnant with their 6th child. As Leonilda realized her husband was dying, she started praying fervently to God to help her husband during his last moments. Even though she was in an advanced state of pregnancy, her only concern at that time was her husband. As darkness fell, their dogs in the courtyard began to howl, so Leonilda went outside to calm them. When she was in the courtyard, she went into labor, and with the help of a family servant, she gave birth to a baby girl. As she was giving birth to the child, she saw a young Capuchin monk. In the state Leonilda was, she could not figure out whether she was hallucinating or was having a vision. With the newborn baby in her arms, she went back to attend to her husband. Giovanni Battista Rizzani died shortly after this. After her husband's death, Leonilda, along with her children, moved to Rome to be near her parents. Many years later, in the summer of 1922, the girl, Giovanna, who had been born the night her father died, was about to enter college. During this period, she was assailed by serious doubts about her Christian faith and was seeking answers to a number of questions. One afternoon, she went to St. Peter's Basilica with a friend to speak to a priest who could help her in her dilemma. The guard on duty at that time told them it was too late and that all the priests had already left for the day. Then the two girls started looking at the statues in the basilica. At that time, Giovanna saw a Capuchin priest in front of her. She at once went up to him and asked him if he would hear her confession. He agreed, and they went into the nearest confessional. In the confessional, instead of confessing her sins, she asked the priest a number of questions regarding her faith. The priest was able to dispel her doubts in a very convincing manner. Giovanna came out of the confessional in a very happy state of mind. As they were leaving, Giovanna told her friend, "That priest is a very gifted man. Let's wait for him. I want to ask him where he lives so that I might speak with him again." So they waited for the priest to come out from his side of the confessional. Soon they realized that the priest had somehow managed to leave without their noticing him. The following summer, in 1923, Giovanna heard about Padre Pio and had a strong desire to meet him. Then she, along with an aunt and a few friends, made the trip to San Giovanni Rotondo to see Padre Pio. When they reached the church at San Giovanni Rotondo, there was a huge crowd already waiting for Padre Pio. Giovanna somehow managed to find a place in front of everyone. When Padre Pio was passing by, he stopped in front of her and, looking into her eyes, smilingly said, "Giovanna, I know you. You were born the day your father died." Next morning, when she went to confess to him, Padre Pio said, "My daughter, at last you've come to me. I've been waiting for you for so many years." When Giovanna said he may be mistaking her for someone else, Padre Pio told her that last year, on a summer afternoon, you went to St. Peter's Basilica with a friend, looking for a priest who could help you understand the doubts you were having about your faith. You met a Capuchin priest and talked with him. I was that Capuchin priest. He further revealed to her that when she was being born, the Virgin Mary took him to her mansion in Udine and entrusted Giovanna to him. Now he said he had to care for her soul. Many years later, in September 1968, when Giovanna was in Rome, she heard Padre Pio's voice telling her, "Come immediately to San Giovanni Rotondo, because I'll be going away. If you don't hurry, you'll never see me again." The very next day, she reached San Giovanni Rotondo. After Padre Pio heard her confession, he told her, "This is your last confession with me." When Giovanna asked, "Why?" "Because my hour has come," he replied. "I'm going away." A few days later, Padre Pio passed away on the early morning of September 23, 1968. Whole life for God and only God. Pio received the 5 wounds of Christ, 2 on his feet, 2 on the palms of his hands, and 1 on the side near the heart. Attracted by his miracles, people flocked to him from all corners of the globe. Yet it was not his miracles, but it was his love for God, and his love for man that won people's hearts. He once wrote, "I am devoured by the love of God and the love of my neighbor. God is always fixed in my mind and stamped in my heart. I never lose sight of him. I can admire his beauty, his smiles, his vexation, his mercy, his vengeance, or rather, the rigors of his justice." Padre Pio's only desire was to be a poor friar who prays. He did not take any credit for the miracles that he performed. For him, these miracles were gifts that came from God, and they belonged to God. When his friend Angelo Battisti once questioned him about these things, Padre Pio replied, "Angelo, they are a mystery for me too." The Italian journalist writes, "I was extremely impressed, not so much by the stories of miracles that people told about him, but by the extraordinary moral strength that emanated from his whole being. When he would lift his head and look around, his big eyes looked like they were burning, not from pain, but from a goodness that he could not contain." Unlike most people, when Padre Pio prayed, God literally spoke to him either through a word or a vision. In a letter to his spiritual director, Padre Pio wrote, "My ordinary way of praying is this. Hardly do I begin to pray, then at once I feel my soul begin to recollect itself in a peace and tranquility that I cannot express in words." Sometimes Padre Pio felt touched by the Lord in a way that is so vivid and so sweet that most of the time I am constrained to shed tears of sorrow for my infidelity and for the tender mercy of having a Father so loving and so good as to summon me thus to his presence. Padre Pio once told his friend, Padre Agostino, that from early childhood he had seen and spoken to Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and his guardian angel. He thought this was something that happened to everyone. "Don't you see the Madonna?" he asked his friend. When Agostino denied this, Padre Pio shrugged his shoulders and said, "Surely you're saying that out of humility." On the one hand, Padre Pio had visions of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and the angels, and on the other, he was attacked by the devil. When attacking Padre Pio, the devil took horrible and frightening forms. The devil started persecuting him from the time he was 4 years old. Padre Pio himself recounted once, "My mother would turn off the lights, and so many monsters would close in on me that I would cry. She would turn the lights on, and I would quiet down because the monsters vanished. Once she turned them off again, I would begin to cry again because of the monsters." The devil did not always limit himself to gruesome appearances. He even beat him to the point where he was bleeding. Once Brother Pio recorded the following note in his diary, "Last night, it seemed like the demons wanted to finish me off. I didn't know what saint to turn to. I called out to my guardian angel, and after having to wait a little, he finally came to my aid." All through his life, Padre Pio suffered from a number of illnesses, like very high fevers, asthma, intestinal trouble, pulmonary infections, and bronchitis. Even more painful than these illnesses was the pain that he experienced in bearing the wounds of the stigmata in his hands, feet, and side. Even the slightest touch to his hands caused him intense pain. When he walked, he rested his weight on the edges of his feet and his heels so as not to press on the wounds of his feet. In 1904, when Brother Pio joined the monastery in Sant'Elia, a Pianesi, he started to suffer from strange illnesses. Doctors who checked on him could not find an explanation for them. He suffered intensely from intestinal irritability and had terrible headaches. He often vomited whatever he ate and could hold down only few spoonfuls of water. His health was so precarious that his superiors decided to send him home till he got better. From 1905, he began to return home to his birthplace, Pietrelcina, for long periods of time. Then, from 1910 to 1916, he lived in Pietrelcina almost uninterruptedly. From 1916 on, he started living in the monastery of Our Lady of Grace in San Giovanni Rotondo, where he remained for the rest of his life, except during the short period of time he served in the army. Everyone is subject to the trials from the devil, for we are flesh and spirit, and the battle confronts us as long as the world exists. The Church has always taught dogmatically about the existence of Satan and his devils. Our Lady of Fatima reinvigorated this truth when she showed the three little seers hell with all its hideous punishments without end. Sometimes God permits the devil freer reign than he does at other times. Padre Pio also suffered persecutions, besides of the mortification he undertook as a private penance, unjust suppression for a time by the Church because of the sensation of his stigmata. The other persecution was trial by the devil. It was during this time that St. Pio started directing a number of holy persons by correspondence, and his missives are considered spiritual masterpieces. Still, however, he sometimes explicitly described his own soul as entering the dark night, which St. John of the Cross wrote of at length in his book, The Dark Night of the Soul. This dark night is the test of aridity and sense of abandonment which God seems to reserve for those who have followed him with sublime generosity and are destined for the greatest sanctity.